When a leader moves into a bunker, the official explanation is always framed in the language of safety and precaution, but the deeper meaning is far more revealing. Power is not only exercised through laws, armies, and institutions, it is also exercised through perception. Leaders survive politically by projecting confidence, stability, and control. The moment that projection changes from public visibility to underground protection, the psychological balance shifts. A bunker is not simply a physical structure made of concrete and steel. It is a political symbol that tells citizens and observers that the leadership no longer feels secure in its own position. That signal spreads faster than any announcement because people instinctively understand what retreat looks like, even when it is wrapped in official statements. History shows us that strong leadership does not hide during moments of pressure. It adapts, negotiates, reforms, and confronts challenges openly. When leaders choose isolation instead, they create a vacuum of reassurance. The public begins to ask uncomfortable questions. What does the leadership know that we do not? What threats are approaching? Why is there fear at the top? These questions generate uncertainty, and uncertainty is one of the most destabilizing forces in any political system. It weakens loyalty, fuels rumors, and amplifies opposition voices that argue the system is fragile. There is also a contradiction at the heart of bunker politics. While leaders protect themselves physically, they often expose the system politically. The image of retreat undermines the narrative of strength that governments carefully construct. Allies become cautious, wondering whether they are tied to a partner that feels cornered. Rivals become more aggressive, sensing vulnerability. Inside the country, institutions that depend on centralized authority start operating defensively, focusing more on self preservation than on serving the public. This is how a symbolic move can ripple outward and affect multiple layers of governance. The bunker also reflects a deeper imbalance between rulers and the ruled. When leaders withdraw into protected spaces, they create a visible separation from the daily struggles of ordinary people. While citizens face rising prices, limited opportunities, and social pressure, the leadership appears insulated from the consequences of its own decisions. That gap fuels resentment and weakens the social contract. People begin to feel that the system is designed to protect power rather than protect society. Once that belief takes hold, restoring trust becomes extremely difficult. What makes this even more dangerous is that fear at the top often leads to harsher policies at the bottom. When leaders feel threatened, they tend to increase control, tighten restrictions, and limit public expression. This creates a cycle where repression generates more dissatisfaction, dissatisfaction creates more fear, and fear drives further isolation. The bunker, in this sense, is not just a response to insecurity, it becomes part of the mechanism that deepens it. It turns governance into a defensive posture rather than a constructive one, pushing the political system into survival mode instead of development mode, reinforcing the idea that power is something to be guarded rather than something to be shared, shaping public consciousness around anxiety instead of stability, and transforming leadership from a visible source of direction into a distant and protected authority figure that operates behind barriers rather than among the people. When political leaders retreat into bunkers, the economic consequences begin almost immediately, even if no official policy changes are announced. Markets operate on confidence as much as on data. Investors, traders, and businesses read leadership behavior as a signal of risk. A move underground is interpreted as preparation for instability, conflict, or internal unrest. That perception alone can trigger capital flight, currency pressure, and hesitation in long term investment. When money becomes cautious, economic growth slows, and the burden of that slowdown does not fall on elites with protected assets. It falls on workers, small businesses, and families who depend on daily economic activity to survive. Inflation is often one of the first visible outcomes of political fear. When uncertainty rises, supply chains become fragile. Importers delay shipments, exporters face new restrictions, and transportation costs increase due to security concerns. These disruptions translate into higher prices for basic goods such as food, fuel, and medicine. For ordinary people, this is not an abstract economic trend. It is felt in grocery stores, at fuel stations, and in monthly household budgets. While officials speak in technical language about stabilization and resilience, the public experiences a steady erosion of purchasing power. At the same time, government spending priorities tend to shift under conditions of perceived threat. Resources are redirected towards security, surveillance, and military preparedness. Funds that could be invested in education, healthcare, infrastructure, and job creation are instead absorbed by defensive strategies. This creates a long term development problem. Societies that overinvest in protection and underinvest in people weaken their productive capacity. The economy becomes less innovative, less competitive, and more dependent on emergency measures rather than sustainable growth. Small and medium sized businesses are especially vulnerable in this environment. They rely on predictable conditions to plan, hire, and expand. When leadership signals instability, entrepreneurs hesitate to take risks. Credit becomes harder to access as banks tighten lending standards. This leads to fewer new businesses, fewer job opportunities, and slower wage growth. Young people entering the labor market face limited prospects, which increases frustration and social tension. Economic stagnation then feeds back into political instability, creating a loop that is difficult to break. There is also a psychological cost that economists often underestimate. Fear changes consumer behavior. People reduce spending, delay major purchases, and prioritize saving over investment. While this may seem rational at an individual level, collectively it slows economic circulation. Demand falls, production decreases, and unemployment rises. The economy contracts not because of a natural disaster or resource shortage, but because confidence has been replaced by anxiety. What makes this dynamic particularly unjust is the uneven distribution of risk. Political elites often have access to foreign assets, secure financial networks, and protected income streams. They can shield themselves from the worst economic effects. Ordinary citizens cannot. They face rising costs, job insecurity, and declining public services. The bunker becomes a symbol not only of physical separation, but of economic separation as well, representing a leadership that can afford fear while the population pays for it through reduced living standards, shrinking opportunities, and a future that feels increasingly uncertain. When leadership withdraws into protected spaces, the damage to social trust begins quietly but spreads deeply. Trust is the invisible foundation of any stable society. It connects citizens to institutions, people to one another, and communities to the idea of a shared future. When a leader chooses isolation over public engagement, it sends a message that the bond between authority and the population is weakening. People do not only observe the physical act of retreat, they interpret its meaning. They begin to feel that those in power are no longer standing with them, but standing apart from them. This separation creates a psychological distance that is often more harmful than physical barriers. Citizens expect leadership to be present during moments of uncertainty, to communicate clearly, and to show empathy. When that presence disappears, rumors and speculation fill the gap. Social media, informal networks, and street conversations become alternative sources of information. Some of these narratives are exaggerated, some are misleading, but all of them gain strength because official communication feels distant or controlled. The result is a fragmented information environment where people trust each other less and question everything they hear. Public alienation also grows when people sense unequal treatment. While leaders operate from fortified locations, ordinary citizens continue to face daily risks, economic pressure, and social instability. This contrast deepens feelings of injustice. It reinforces the idea that the system is designed to protect power rather than protect people. When this perception spreads, civic participation declines, voter engagement weakens, community cooperation fades, and public institutions lose legitimacy. People stop believing that their voices matter. And when voices feel powerless, frustration often replaces hope. Young generations are particularly sensitive to this shift. They are more connected, more aware of global standards, and more likely to compare their reality with other societies. When they see leadership retreating instead of reforming, they interpret it as a lack of vision. This discourages long term commitment to national development. Talented individuals look for opportunities elsewhere, creating brain drain and weakening the country's human capital. The social cost of this loss is enormous because it removes the very people who could help rebuild trust and innovation. Another critical effect is the rise of social polarization. In the absence of transparent leadership, different groups begin to interpret events through their own ideological, cultural, or economic lenses. This creates competing narratives about responsibility, blame, and solutions. Instead of unified responses to national challenges, society becomes divided into camps that distrust one another. Dialogue turns into accusation, cooperation turns into competition, and compromise becomes politically dangerous. Over time, this erosion of trust reshapes daily behavior. People become more cautious in public spaces, less willing to collaborate, and more focused on personal survival strategies. Community solidarity weakens. Informal support networks replace institutional ones. While these networks may help individuals cope, they also signal a retreat from collective responsibility. The social fabric slowly thins, not through dramatic collapse, but through gradual disengagement, emotional distance, and the normalization of low expectations from leadership and from each other. When a leader moves into a bunker, the signal is not contained within national borders. It travels across diplomatic channels, intelligence networks, media headlines, and global markets. Other governments interpret this action as a shift in posture, often assuming that heightened tension or confrontation is approaching. Even without official statements, the symbolism alone can trigger recalculations among regional powers. Allies begin to question stability, rivals begin to test boundaries, and neutral states start preparing for potential spillover effects. This is how a single domestic decision can reshape the strategic atmosphere of an entire region. Regional tension intensifies because uncertainty forces governments to act defensively. When one state appears to be preparing for worst case scenarios, neighboring states feel pressure to do the same. Military budgets rise, security cooperation shifts, and diplomatic language becomes more rigid. Instead of confidence building measures, countries prioritize deterrence and preparedness. This environment reduces flexibility. Leaders become less willing to compromise because compromise can be interpreted as weakness. As positions harden, the space for negotiation narrows, making de escalation more difficult, even when all sides would benefit from it. International diplomacy also suffers in this climate. Diplomatic efforts rely on openness, dialogue, and mutual trust. When a leader retreats into isolation, direct communication becomes limited and filtered through layers of bureaucracy and security structures. Messages take longer to reach decision makers, misunderstandings become more common, and symbolic gestures lose their impact. In moments of crisis, timing and clarity are crucial. Delays and ambiguity can turn manageable disagreements into prolonged standoffs. The bunker, therefore, does not only protect an individual leader, it complicates the entire diplomatic process. Economic relationships between countries are also affected by this escalation dynamic. Trade partners reassess risk, shipping routes are reconsidered, and insurance costs rise for businesses operating in the region. These changes may seem technical, but they have real consequences. Higher transportation costs increase consumer prices, disrupted trade reduces access to essential goods, and uncertainty discourages foreign investment. Regional economies become more fragile, and smaller states with limited economic resilience suffer the most. The geopolitical tension created by symbolic acts of fear thus spreads into everyday economic life across borders. Another important dimension is the role of global powers. When regional instability appears to increase, major international actors often step in, either through diplomatic pressure, strategic alliances, or economic measures. While some interventions aim to stabilize the situation, others are driven by competition for influence. This can transform a regional issue into a broader power struggle. Local concerns become entangled with global rivalries, making solutions more complex and harder to achieve. The original problem becomes layered with new interests, agendas, and expectations. Public perception on the international stage also changes. Media coverage amplifies the narrative of crisis, shaping how global audiences understand the situation. This affects tourism, cultural exchange, and people to people connections. Countries associated with instability face reputational damage that can take years to repair. The bunker, in this sense, becomes a symbol not only of internal fear, but of regional uncertainty, reinforcing cycles of suspicion, strategic competition, and diplomatic rigidity that move far beyond the original decision and reshape the geopolitical environment in ways that are difficult to reverse. The idea that physical protection equals real security is one of the most persistent illusions in modern politics. Bunkers, fortified compounds, and advanced defense systems create the appearance of control, but they cannot address the deeper forces that determine whether a society is stable or fragile. Real stability is built on legitimacy, public trust, and inclusive governance. When leaders invest more in walls than in relationships with their people, they misunderstand the nature of power. Power does not come from isolation, it comes from consent, cooperation, and the shared belief that institutions exist to serve the public good. Transparency plays a central role in this equation. When governments communicate openly, acknowledge challenges, and involve citizens in decision making, they create a sense of collective responsibility. People are more willing to accept short term sacrifices when they understand the reasons behind them and believe that the burden is shared fairly. In contrast, secrecy and isolation breed suspicion. When leaders hide, people assume there is something to hide. This perception undermines credibility and weakens the moral authority of institutions. Without credibility, even well designed policies struggle to gain public support.